Raita Merivirta her talk is Finding the Villain of the Story, Eamon de Valera in Neil Jordan's Michael Collins scripts. And just to introduce Raita, she is an Academy of Finland postdoctoral fellow at the University of Turku, and her research interests include Irish film and history, Indian English literature, and Finns in the colonial world. It's a very broad spectrum there of films and research material. And she's author of The Gun and Irish Politics, examining national history in Neil Jordan's Michael Collins for Peter Lang in 2009, The Emergency and Indian English novel, Memory, Culture and Politics for Routledge 2019. And she's co-editor of Finnish Colonial Encounters from Anti-Imperialism to Cultural Colonialism and Complicity for Palgrave 2021. And she also has published on India and film, Bollywood cinema, and colonialism and race in older Finnish children's literature. So welcome, Raita.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Neil Jordan's Michael Collins depicts the Irish Revolution from the Easter Rising to the death of Collins during the Civil War. The film portrayed Eamon de Valera in such a negative light that it was described as anti-Dev and as developing Dev phobia by some critics. Jealous, prudish, scheming, occasionally hysterical and fanatical, the portrayal of Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins is not flattering. On the 20th anniversary of the film, Jordan explained, quote, "He was the villain of that period in a strange way. I tried to not make judgments on de Valera. De Valera alone was not responsible for the Civil War, but he was a pivotal factor in the fact that there was a civil war. They weren't his best years. The movie chose a villain and it found him." End quote. In this paper, I examine how de Valera became the lead villain of Michael Collins. Jordan began to work on the film in October 1982 when he had finished his first feature film, Angel. Producer David Putnam, who was at the time working for Warner Brothers, commissioned a script about Michael Collins. Jordan finished his script, entitled Evergreen, in 1983. It is essentially very similar in structure to the finished film. Eamon de Valera's role, however, is rather marginal in the script. He makes his first appearance when Collins breaks him out of jail. De Valera then departs almost immediately for America to get recognition for the Republic. After de Valera and Harry Boland's return from America and the full-scale attack on the customs house, which leads to a truce, de Valera orders Collins to go to London to negotiate with the British. There is not much drama in this scene, though Collins does indicate that he is reluctant to go. Similarly, the drama of the film around the terms and acceptance of the treaty negotiated in 1921 is largely missing, as there is no direct confrontation between Collins and de Valera, who simply votes against the treaty in the Dáil. When the anti-treaty armed forces occupy the four courts in Dublin, Collins meets Boland and asks him how far de Valera will take it. Boland answers, "It's not him anymore, it's the army," thus absolving de Valera from responsibility for the civil war that is about to begin. After his vote against the treaty, de Valera is seen only once, at a remote cottage, asking if there is any news. Upon hearing that Collins is in West Cork, de Valera says, "Then we wait." The producer of Michael Collins, Stephen Woolley, reflected on the production process in retrospect, saying, quote, "The script fell into what they call development hell. The scale of the project demanded a certain rank of director, and I don't think Neil at that time had enough weight to command that kind of budget." End quote. Jordan has explained that he then established a rhythm for the next 12 years. Quote, "I would write a draft, do my best to get it made, then, while awaiting a reply, go and make another film." End quote. In the process, the portrayal of de Valera changed considerably. David Putnam, who had commissioned the script, felt that Jordan's first draft, Jordan writes, quote, "lacked a committed sense of the central character, and more important or more disturbingly, lacked an identifiable villain." End quote. At Enigma Production Company, it was felt that the script, quote, "should have a consistent sense of de Valera as a character through the script after his release." End quote. It was also wondered if the assassination should be made even more dramatic. Commenting on Jordan's second draft in autumn 1984, people from Enigma wrote to Putnam saying that, quote, "De Valera is too sketchy a figure to take on the role of opposition to Collins previously occupied by the British forces. The enormous dramatic and ironic potential that the schism provides is thus not exploited." End quote. Film producer Barry Spikings wrote to Putnam in September 1984 regarding the script, quote, "I suspect there needs to be a more dramatic scene covering de Valera's denunciation of the treaty and more of a sense that Collins was set up. End quote. Subsequently, De Valera's role grows script by script and his villainy increases from zero to that of the main bad guy, whereas Collins becomes more likable. The script from June 1986 introduces De Valera quite early, presiding over a Sinn Féin cabinet meeting where the matter of the cabinet taking responsibility of the volunteers is discussed. The conflict between De Valera and Collins begins to brew here, as Collins warns the cabinet that they may be arrested that night, so they should not sleep at home that night. De Valera then orders the cabinet to do just that because he expects a public outcry if they are lifted. Collins objects, but De Valera silences him with a sharp look, which leaves Collins seething quietly. De Valera is arrested that night, but Collins and Boland manage to break him out later with a key made from an imprint De Valera has made of a prison chaplain's key while the chaplain was disrobing. Collins makes fun of De Valera robbing a naked padre and notes that there are certain things one doesn't do for one's country. Everyone except De Valera laughs, which builds up tension. While De Valera and Collins have had differing opinions about the importance of America and where Boland should be, in Dublin with Collins or touring America with De Valera, their view of the military tactics in Dublin once De Valera has returned from America causes a further rift between them. De Valera wants to have large-scale engagements while Collins prefers to keep going as they have so far done. De Valera's view obviously prevails. When the British suggest a truce and negotiations in London, there is no discussion between De Valera and Collins. Collins merely tells Boland that De Valera wants him to go. Similarly, after the signing of the treaty, the headlines proclaim that De Valera rejects it, but there is no encounter between De Valera and Collins. An RIC barracks is taken over by volunteers before the elections. Collins talks with Ernie O'Malley, who says that they'll defend the Republic. Collins: where did you get your orders? O'Malley: from the volunteer executive. Collins: you mean Dev's half of it. McOwen says that they could split down the middle. Collins, on the other hand, says to his Free Staters that he wants things to stay as they are until the elections. If the people then reject the treaty, they can do as they will. After the occupation of the Four Courts, Boland again tells Collins that it's not De Valera anymore, it's the army, making it thus clear that De Valera is not behind the armed conflict. In the last scene involving De Valera, he's in a cottage in a mountainous area like in the first script, asking for news. So De Valera is still only one of the characters among the others in 1986, and there are only some hints of drama and disagreements. In the 1989 script, there is a direct confrontation between De Valera and Collins when the former orders the latter to go to London to negotiate. When Collins brings back the treaty, De Valera is enraged and yells, "You published the terms without my agreement." Collins defends the treaty much the same way as in the film and accuses De Valera of sending him to London because he knew that those were the best terms they could hope to get. Another important change concerns the final days of Collins. After Boland's death in the Civil War, O'Reilly tells the Republican that he should tell De Valera that Collins wants to talk. O'Reilly is told that there might be a chance in Cork. In the 1986 script, it was still tell them that Mick wants to talk. Now it is De Valera to whom Collins wants to talk. In Cork, Collins enters a hay barn to meet De Valera, but instead encounters a young Republican who wants to know what Collins will suggest. Collins says that he wants to end the bloody mayhem, that Boland's death was enough. De Valera listens up in the loft, in silence. According to the notes concerning the rewrite of the script in December 1990, the drama was to be centered on Collins and Boland, with Kitty between them, and the whole section of London negotiations was to be cut out. The February 1991 script does exactly this. A notable addition to the script concerning the relationship between Collins and De Valera is Collins professing his loyalty to the hidden De Valera in the hay barn in Cork. As Collins emphasizes that De Valera was always his chief, the sense of betrayal becomes heightened from this script forward. In the 1994 script, the encounter between Collins and De Valera after the latter's return from America has become even more dramatic and confrontational. When De Valera wants to have large-scale engagements so that the press cannot portray them as murderers, Collins remarks, "We might as well save them the bother and blow our own brains out," as in the film. In this version, Collins keeps on complaining about De Valera's command to his own men, strongly disagreeing with his chief. And when De Valera asks after the attack on the customs house how long they can hold out, Collins replies, 4 weeks, unless you want us to use bows and arrows. De Valera reprimands Collins by saying, "Don't be flippant, Michael." De Valera's responsibility for the Civil War and his involvement in Collins's death are also entering the picture here. When Boland and Collins talk about the situation after the occupation of the Four Corps, Boland no longer says that it is not De Valera, it is the army. The audience is then inclined to think that De Valera is in some kind of control of the anti-treaty forces. Faxes from Robert Brazel of Warner Brothers to Neil Jordan and Stephen Woolley in early January 1995, some months before the shooting of the film, make many detailed suggestions for changes. Among them, Brazel writes that it is not clear how De Valera feels about Collins's successes while he is in jail. He also notes that the scene in which Collins makes fun of De Valera after he has been broken out of jail reveals quite subtly De Valera's feelings about Collins. Brazel wondered if that was enough to convey to the audience the seeds of mistrust. These concerns were addressed in the shooting script of 1995. In the final script and the film, De Valera is disguised for his jailbreak as a prostitute with a fur coat and a feathered hat. According to Tim Pat Coogan, Boland and De Valera did impersonate a courting couple, but with Boland playing the woman. The change of roles in the film becomes significant when De Valera, still dressed as a prostitute, sits in the hijacked taxi between Boland and Collins. De Valera: there are certain things one shouldn't do for one's country. Boland: like go on the game. Collins: some died for Ireland, but Dev, he whored for Ireland. De Valera: I suppose it does set a historical precedent. Collins: I'll take you home again, Kathleen. Jealousy surfaces when Boland breaks the news about America to Collins, who then confronts De Valera by saying that their work is at home. De Valera replies authoritatively that their work is where he says it is. Collins then pleads with De Valera to at least leave him Harry. I can't run a war without Harry Boland, to which De Valera replies in a rather jealous tone, you could run it without me. The impression of jealousy is further reinforced when De Valera returns to Dublin. He is not happy to hear Collins being referred to as the big fella and mutters to himself, we'll see who's the big fella. He then goes on to order a full-scale attack on the customs house against Collins's advice. After the ratification of the treaty by the Dáil, it is not only Collins who makes public speeches, but also De Valera. Quote, this treaty bars the way to independence with the blood of fellow Irishmen, and if it is only with civil war we can get our independence, so be it. The volunteers may have to wade through Irish blood, through the blood of some members of the government, in order to get Irish freedom. End quote. More incriminating evidence against De Valera is given when the armed Republicans pour out of cars and occupy the Four Courts, while the caption reads, 7th June 1922, the treaty is carried by popular vote. De Valera and his supporters refuse to accept it. The death of Collins in the film is preceded by an encounter between Collins and a young Republican, much like in the earlier script, but in the film the hidden De Valera sobs in response to Collins's words about his loyalty to De Valera and about wanting to end the war, and says, oh Jesus Mick, God forgive us, Harry. To the young man's inquiry about a reply, De Valera answers with silence. The messenger then takes the initiative and goes back to the pub to tell Collins that De Valera will meet him the next day. The travelling Collins is then killed by the young man. Elizabeth Cullingford has pointed out that although, quote, Jordan's diary and the screenplay make it clear that De Valera is not literally responsible for Collins's death, the effect of the film is nevertheless extremely ambiguous, end quote. Left out of the film is the part of the published screenplay where De Valera replies to the message that Collins wants to talk. Doesn't he know it's out of my hands? He then goes on to mutter to himself, you should have listened to me, Michael. You heard, but you didn't listen. This may have been one of the scenes Alan Rickman mentioned in 2009 with regard to the criticism of the film for its portrayal of De Valera and its implication that De Valera was involved in Collins's death. Quote, I suppose with hindsight one should be more aware that there were going to be external pressures once you finished the film in terms of how it is cut, and so scenes that we shot did not end up in the movie. I think ultimately those would have altered the tone of the film. It was quite clear to me that De Valera was not involved in the death of Collins. End quote. Jordan explained after the release of Michael Collins that he grew up under the island of Eamon De Valera and wasn't too happy about that. Jordan's take on De Valera has usually been interpreted through this lens, and this was Jordan venting his feelings about De Valera and his island. While I am not trying to suggest that this interpretation is not valid, I myself have also subscribed to this view, I have tried to demonstrate in my presentation that there were also other forces, the external pressures Rickman spoke about at work, even if the film was written and directed by Neil Jordan. Jordan's first draft wasn't anti-Dev, as De Valera only played a minor role in the script, focusing on Michael Collins, with the organising of the national loan and the affair with Lady Lavery included. De Valera's role and villainy grew script by script, often at the suggestion of various film producers and representatives of American production companies. The first script lacks an identifiable villain, and when the movie chose one, it found De Valera, with Jordan's assistance, obviously. And then there are some alternative end scenes that were discussed. There were others, not just these two, but there was this one bookending scene that was suggested. I'll just let you read it. Other one, these were the end captions, and the first two are similar to the one that they actually used, but there were other changes here, like over the De Valera years, many of Michael Collins's hopes were fulfilled as the Irish Republic became a thriving, peaceful democracy, although his achievements were effectively excluded from history books. These statements didn't make the film. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.